All right. Hey guys. So we are live today. I have a very special guest on, and I'm really excited to talk about 1031 exchanges and also QOZs. So I know I normally have music on right now, but my mic had been messing up so bad when I turned it on. So I'm super sorry about that. But um, I want to introduce our lovely guest. So this is Kyla. So Kyla, why don't you tell us like what you do?
Sure. So, Kyla McMoran, I am an independent financial advisor. Our company is Bravest Wealth Management, and I've been in the business for a couple of years now, almost 3, I guess now. Joined my dad in the company. He's been doing this for like 30 plus years, and finally joined the company business and super excited to hang out with him. Before I get too far and make my compliance happy, I've got a little disclosure that they wanted me to read because we're going to talk about some really cool, exciting stuff. But with investments, there's all these rules and laws and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to read you the boring part. We'll just get that out of the way. So information shared today is for educational purposes only, does not constitute suitability or individual investment advice, and should not be relied upon as tax or legal advice. Individuals should consult the appropriate professional regarding their situation. There are risks involved with investing, including but not limited to being speculative, lack of liquidity, loss of entire principal, and results or returns are not guaranteed or may be lower than anticipated. Please review all risks associated with this content within the post. I offer securities through Concord Investment Services, LLC. They are a member of FINRA and SIPC. Bravest Wealth Management is independent of Concord, and both Bravest and Concord are independent of OK Realtor Marcy Billen. So I got all the boring legalized stuff out of the way. Yay! We will talk about some of those things that I kind of hit on later when it comes to investments and cool. Taxes and all those kind of things. So we'll get into a little bit more of that, but got the boring stuff out. So now we can have fun.
Thank you so much. So if this is your first time to hop on here and watch me during one of my lives, I'm Marcy Bill and I am a real estate agent here in Oklahoma. I work in the Oklahoma City Metro, and so does Kyla. So that's how we know each other. So we wanted to bring you some information about 1031 exchanges and qualified opportunity zones here in Oklahoma. So Kyla, will you tell us briefly what a 1031 exchange is, and then jump over to that QOZ and kind of like give an overview of what we're talking about?
Sure. So a basic 1031 exchange is when somebody who owns an investment property, so think of a commercial property or farmland would also qualify. When they sell that property, they have a taxable gain on that property. But if they reinvest those sales proceeds, they could do what's called a 1031 tax exchange. So that defers those capital gains from one sale of the property until they sell it next time. So you don't have to pay that capital gain. So that's the real basic idea of what a 1031 exchange is. Qualified opportunity zone is a relatively new form. It just came around in 2017, so it's pretty fresh still.
Nice.
So it, especially in the Oklahoma City, I always use this example. Oklahoma City metro area will understand what Bricktown looked like before Bricktown was revitalized. So the idea with qualified opportunity zone is taking areas that need to be revitalized and refurbished and kind of turn them in and redevelop those spaces. So that's always when I'm talking to local groups, they understand, most people, if they're my age or older, understand and remember what Bricktown used to look like. So governors several years ago were allowed to designate specific areas in each state. And so there are areas all around the state of Oklahoma, but it's in a specific area of different cities where they can develop. And we'll get into some of the more details of that later.
So how are these two things different? Like, what are the main differences, I guess, then?
Well, so there's several, lots of layers. That's a big question. So the main thing with the 1031 is it's specific to property. So if I sell an investment property that I have, and I can defer those taxes really in perpetuity. So if I sell a property and reinvest it, sell that property, reinvest it, I can do a 1031 over and over until the day that I pass on.
And not pay taxes.
So and ideally, and if you do it over and over again, you could defer those taxes for life.
Okay.
In a QOZ, it's got some different timelines, and I know we're going to get into details of timelines later, but right now, so it started in 2017, so it's got a 10-year window right now. So if I sold something right now and invested in QOZ, I can defer those taxes through December 31st of 2026, so about 3 years from now.
Okay.
And then, so that doesn't defer it forever like a 1031 potentially does, but it gives me between now and December of 2026 to kind of make a plan on how to pay that capital gains, that kind of stuff. So it gives me a few years. And then there's some other tax incentives and stuff that I think we're going to talk about later.
Okay.
But those are the main timelines. 1031 potentially forever. QOZ definitely has a shorter timeline.
Okay. Okay, nice. That clears up a lot. So then what is the main tax benefit associated with the 1031 compared to the QOZ?
Right. These are definitely some similarities, but differences. So at the baseline, the idea with these investments is to defer capital gains. So that's step one. Like I just said, on a 1031, you could potentially defer that over and over again and forever if you never realize those capital gains. And by realizing if I sold that property and didn't reinvest, then those gains will go onto my income for that year, and I will owe taxes on those.
Okay.
But if I keep doing those 1031s, potentially defer forever.
Okay.
Now with the QOZ, there's a couple of different timelines. I just mentioned that 3 years. So between now and the end of December 31st, 2026, I've got that time where those taxes are deferred.
Okay.
Then, and that will show up at the end of 2026. So my 2027 taxes, I will have to pay those capital gains. Now there's a second kind of timeline that's a little bit, so the next layer of the QOZ. The cool thing about the QOZ is everything that I invest, even though I'm going to have to pay my initial capital gains from selling something, everything that's invested in that QOZ, if I hold it for 10 years, all of the gains inside the QOZ investment are tax-free. So if you're familiar with how a Roth IRA works, in a Roth IRA, you invest money after you've already paid your income taxes. So all the growth inside of a Roth is tax-free, different than a traditional. If you do a traditional IRA, you pay those monies into there before you pay income taxes. So then later on, when I start pulling income out of the traditional IRA, that tax is still due at that time. So it's kind of, do I pay taxes now and not have to pay them later, or do I defer those taxes and pay them later? So kind of, hopefully that explains that if you understand kind of how a Roth works, a QOZ is similar to that. All the gains are tax-free, which is a really cool tax benefit.
Yeah, no, that is really cool. Okay, so what types of properties are we talking about with the QOZs, and how is it different from the 1031 properties?
Well, so this also, again, lots of layers. This is a complex conversation, which I love that you're having this conversation with people. So flag me down if I just kind of go off on the rails on some of these things. So we'll start with a 1031. So if you do what I would call a normal 1031, so if I own a rental property and I decide to sell it and I want to buy another rental house that's either in a different town or just a different part of area, or if I want to upsize, right? So if I have a 2-bedroom, but I want to sell that one, I want to buy a 3-bedroom, that kind of thing. You can do that. You know, that 1031 is kind of that lower level option.
Okay.
There's no really criteria for that other than, well, so there is some, I say that there's no criteria, there is criteria. So there's a few things to keep in mind. When you are replacing that property, you have to replace the same amount that you owed already. So if I sell a $100,000 house, I have to reinvest that full $100,000. I can go over and above that, but I can't go below it. If I only invest, say, $80,000 of that 100, I'm going to owe the capital gains on that leftover part of it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So you also have to match your debt. So if I have a $100,000 house and I still have a $50,000 mortgage, that's a 50% debt. I have to carry that same debt into the new property that I purchase. So those are a couple of those rules that you have to pay attention to. Where I potentially come in on a 1031 exchange, we have what's called a Delaware Statutory Trust product that is a physical property that people can invest in, and it qualifies as what's called a like kind. So I'm selling one investment property and buying a new investment property. those, there's a whole different level of criteria. You have to be what's called an accredited investor. So what that means in my world is you have to have a net income or a net worth, of $1 million,
Okay.
or as an individual income of 200,000, as a couple income of 300,000. And that is not just in 1 year. That's kind of a doctor, a lawyer, somebody that makes that kind of income and expects to make that income year after year after year.
Okay.
So those are kind of criteria on the 1031 when it's in my world.
Okay.
If I'm just an individual investor and have a rental property, again, you can do those $100,000. I'm selling a house and I'm buying another house. So you don't have to have that upper accredited investor criteria.
Okay.
Now on a QOZ, I think everybody in my world, unless you're a developer yourself, if you're a developer and you want to go in and start a whole thing, you can go into a QOZ and develop. So if you get a bunch of investors together and you want to go build an apartment complex, then you can go do that. But again, on my side of things where we have it, where I can help an individual investor, we're not building anything. There are other companies putting those developments and all that kind of stuff together. We're just going to go and buy a little piece of that pie and help them and raise those capital dollars. So that same accredited investor standard applies on those. Does that answer the main question, I think, of what you were asking?
Yes, I believe so. Yeah. And I know that it's an entire conversation, right? Because these are really interesting ideas and ways to make an impact on community, save taxes, etc. It's a lot. So what sort of time constraints are we talking about?
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is a really important, especially in a 1031 exchange. There are several different time constraints. So, and some rules that I didn't go into earlier. So I'll kind of step back a little bit and talk about some of the rules of what to do before you list a property, while the property is listed, after it sells, that kind of stuff. So we're going to kind of step through all those. So before I even think about calling somebody like Marcy and say, hey, I want to sell this rent house of mine, help me sell it, let's reinvest something. There are what's called a qualified intermediary. They are an attorney and they act as sort of an escrow agent. So when I sell my property, if I sell the property and the check comes to me, then my 1031 exchange is already blown up. And Uncle Sam sees that I have realized those gains and they're going to send me the tax bill.
Okay.
So when you sell a property, or before you even list it, you get in touch with what's called a QI, a qualified intermediary, and you let them know. They kind of basically set up a little account with you. I call Marcy and said, all right, let's sell this place. She helps me sell it. She helps me find that replacement property. Mm-hmm. So then there's a couple of clocks. So from the day that I sell my property, your clock starts ticking. So that's day 0. You have 2 timelines. So the first one is 45 days. So from day 0, day I sell that property, I've got 45 days to identify my replacement property. Okay. And you can't just say, hey, Marcy, yeah, for sure, I'm going to buy something else. Let's do this. You have to identify a specific property. So I have to have the address of this office that I'm buying or that I'm selling, and the address of the office across the street that I'm buying, or the address for when I come into play. If you like the DST option, the Delaware Statutory Trust, I've got that physical address that I would give to the QI for you to identify. Then kind of couched within that timeline, there's a longer timeline of 180 days. So from day 0 that I sell, so we're still on that day 0, I have to close on that property that I've identified within 180 days.
Okay.
So that 45 days sounds like a long time, but really it happens really fast. So that's where I kind of, when I'm talking to people, and really if you, even before you think about listing it, know that you're going to want to do a 1031, that you qualify for a 1031, and kind of have all your ducks in a row and ready to hit the ground running after you sell that property.
Yeah, that's what I've always told my clients who do a 1031. They, sometimes it's hard to know the steps that you have to do at the same time. It's not all consecutive. You have to do things simultaneously. And if you don't, you can really mess up, and you got to know the right questions to ask. So, helping people get through that and protecting their money from the taxes is, it's work, and you just have to know to ask the right questions. So that's really important for sure.
Now, you talked on the QOZ, there's not really a specific Well, there's time constraints. So there's layers. Shocking that I've said that like 15 times already in this conversation. So the standard timeline is 180 days. So again, from day 0, I've realized a capital gain. I have 180 days to close on and invest in a QOZ. Now that varies if I just have a regular capital gain. So if I sell stock, for example, that qualifies as gain. So that also is a differentiator between a 1031. A 1031 is real property only. With a QOZ, you can do any capital gain. So a stock sale, a sale of a business. We always joke when I'm giving this presentation live, if you have that vintage Star Wars nerd collection and you sell that, and you realize a gain. If you have art collection and you sell that, you get a gain. It's a capital gain you can put into a QOZ.
Cool.
Now, so a standard gain. So if I sell stock, art, my nerd collection, that starts 0 and I have 180 days. Now, if you sell a business, depending on how the business is qualified. So this is where, every single individual and investment, you talk to me, you talk to your accountant, you talk to your, attorney, you talk to Marcy, whatever it is. But if you sell a business, depending on how it is, if it's an S Corp, a C Corp, or an LLC, sometimes so if I sell that in February, my 180 days, would be what? Not October. I can't do math real quick while I'm on live. So don't check my math. But you can actually go past your 180 days and you don't have to realize that until December 31st of that year. So you have sometimes in business sales a little bit extra time than that 180 days. So.
But 6 months seems to be like a typical time frame.
Yeah, it's pretty standard. You know, like they're wanting you to get the ball moving. Like, all right, if you're going to reinvest this, let's do it. We want you to stay invested and reinvest and keep those dollars in the community working. So
yeah, for sure. Okay. All right. So how are properties or areas designated for the QOZ, and how is that like this was what was so interesting to me about the QOZ is like, oh, there's like a list of properties. Like what is up with that? Where are they? What does that mean?
So I briefly mentioned this a little bit earlier, but so back in 2017, it was the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is where the QOZ kind of was born out of. And so every governor in every state was given leeway. And so they just got to designate areas. And so depending on which state you're in, depending on who governor is, all that kind of thing, those standards are going to be a little bit different. For example, there's the only QOZ area in Norman. I'm in Norman, so that's the area I know. If you're familiar with where the old Veterans Hospital was on Main and 12th Northeast, right? So there's that Walmart over there, and now it's the lots of nonprofits are in there. But that whole area up from Main Street up to Robinson is a QOZ area. And that's the only one that I'm familiar with in Norman.
Right.
You can look up QOZs if you just Google stuff. I should have pulled up that list and in a website to give you to, but you can Google it pretty quick and you can go state by state and figure out where all the different areas are. But it was up to the discretion of the governor. So there's several, that one in Norman, several around the metro area, but then all over the state. Here in every state. So, so then if I'm a developer and I want to go in and put an apartment complex or a entertainment district or something like that, I, as a developer, get special tax incentives to revitalize that area. But then where we come in as individual investors into the QOZs, developers have already set up that. So we could just as individuals invest in those, just like you would in the stock market. But instead of it, going up and down with the stock market, you're investing in a real property. Okay. Kind of almost like a real estate trust. Very similar. Yes. Yeah. But my dad always, walks like a duck, acts like a duck. But, it's the way the tax and trust is set up a little bit. Some of the legalese and, all those stacks of documents that you get that nobody reads, it's, in there. And we read them sometimes. If my compliance watches this, I promise I read everything.
Yes. Okay. So we kind of answered this question, but it's about the investment durations, like how long they last. We talked about the QOZ being until 2026. What happens after that?
So after 2026, so then in 2027, your taxes would be due. Some of them. Some of the QOZs are set up where they are hoping that their development's already ready and online before 2027, so that they could give you some of your investment back and or give you some of those dividends type thing and help pay that tax liability. But not everyone's set up like so. Some of them will do that. Some of them may not. So just plan on and plan for. That's what you have those 3 years for, is to plan for paying those taxes in 2027.
Okay.
But then if you hold your investment, so just keep round numbers, if I put $100,000 in on that, I'm going to pay my capital gains in 2027, but that $100,000 stays invested. And if you keep it in there for 10 years, all of your gains inside of that or inside of that investment are tax-free. You don't have to pull it out after 10 years. So it's going to be starting to pay you monthly income. So if you like the income and it's paying you well, you don't have to pull it out. You can just keep it in there and leave it. Right now, that sunset date is you can keep it in there till 2047. So there is kind of a long sunset date right now. I know it seems like a long ways away, but
like a sci-fi movie.
I know, right? So, like, how sad is it that some of these movies that we watched when we were a kid, like, right now we're supposed to be in flying cars and like all this crazy stuff. Like, we didn't get any of those things that was, promised as a kid. So 2047, may or not be crazy cool, or it's going to be like tomorrow. So there's current legislation right now. Well, there's not current. They're talking about stuff about expanding that or extending that. But right now, those are kind of your deadlines. So again, December 31st, 2026, then it's going to show up on those taxes. You pay it in 2027, depending on, so I could get in here in 2023, but I could also invest in this QOZ, December 1st of 2026. I only am going to defer it, for a month, but I'm invested in that QOZ. My 10 years starts from whenever I invest.
Okay.
So my 10 years, if I invest today, is going to be 2033. If you invest in 2025, it's going to be 2035. So that makes sense. There's some timelines and more timelines mixed in there. And then again, with the 1031, so individually, I would just always go back to the simple rent house. So if I have a rent house, I sell it, I reinvest it. I, as the individual owner, get to decide when or if I ever put that property up for sale. So that I could hold it for 20 years and have that income. And if I pass on and my beneficiaries inherit, then there's some different tax rules there. But so that timeline can kind of ebb and flow however I decide individually.
Okay.
If you invest in a Delaware statutory trust, one of the main risks of these is I'm not really in control. So I'm invested. It shows that I own real property, but the sponsors, the investors that put these developments together, they're the ones that decide when that property is going to sell. So it may be 4 years from now, it may be 6 years from now, it may be 10 years from now. They're going to decide and sell when the market is a good time to sell that property. So, but I don't control that. So that's one of the main risks, is the potential long-term investment if you use a DST. Now that risk sometimes, if I own a commercial property instead of just a rent house, for example, I had a commercial property here, and it took me 2 years to find somebody to buy it. So I wanted to sell 2 years before that, but it took me a while to sell that. So, so there's some long-term potential holds, even if I'm an individual owner of an individual property that I manage and control myself.
Okay. All right. Okay. So what are we talking about with the local impact for QOZs?
Well, I always go back to that example of Bricktown in Oklahoma City. So, Oklahoma City, that's a little bit different. It wasn't a QOZ, but they did what's called a TIF district or a bid district.
Sure.
And they gave people, investors, tax benefits for investing in that property. And so if you haven't seen, look at the before and after pictures of what that same view of Bricktown was before the riverfront was put down there. And it's insane how different that is. So what that's done for Oklahoma City has just been night and day, making awesome. We have an NBA team now, all those kind of things. That district up there is just awesome. In Norman, the area right there is on the east side. I live on the east side of Norman, so I personally would love to have more options for dining over there or an entertainment district. There's a really cool old church that I've always dreamed of. If I could, like, just wave my magic wand and have $1 million, and would love to turn that into a venue for live music.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, it's just a cool spot. So I personally would love to have that area revitalized and done. I haven't heard of anything. All the talk in Norman, if you're familiar with all the Norman stuff, is the entertainment district up on the northwest side. So, I'm an east side girl, so I'm like, oh, the west side gets all the cool stuff. Like, I want some stuff over here. So, so I'm very biased in that, but but I think it would be really cool for the east side businesses over there and east side folks that live and work over there to have something, or really provide more jobs over there. It could provide affordable housing. It could provide, if there is an entertainment district or something that they put in there, it's going to bring jobs over there. It's just going to bring some economic impact of people. I know I would be spending my money over there. So that would be the impact for sure of a QOZ. With a 1031, it's more of an individual impact because it's affecting my tax return, and I'm deferring those capital gains. So a 1031 is more of per person on the impact, but a QOZ potentially could have citywide, statewide impact.
Sure. Okay. So what are the risks whenever we're talking about a 1031 or a QOZ?
Well, so in a 1031, a couple of the risks are, one, if you don't follow all the rules. So if you don't get your QI, if you don't identify in the right amount of time, if you don't close in the right amount of time, those are kind of the main risks with a 1031.
Okay.
Where when we're talking to investors, you may want to. So if I own commercial property, I want to sell my property, I want to invest and own something here locally. Where we talk about with people with a Delaware statutory trust as kind of a safety net. So yes, I want to own locally, but just in case something falls through, if somebody comes in with an all cash offer, if somebody, or if the inspection comes bad, for whatever reason, my local property falls through, but now all of a sudden I'm at day 45 and I only identified that one property, then my 1031 could get blown up, even though I did everything right. Just something happened with that closing, didn't work.
Sure.
So a Delaware statutory trust could be a good safety net. If you've identified us, you may not want to go in, you may not ever do it, but it's a kind of just in case. If this one falls apart, most of our properties are raising between like $50 and $150 million. So we've got plenty of space and room to make sure that your 1031 is covered. So that is always kind of a safety net there. We also can take what's called the boot. So I'll up my numbers a little bit. So if I sell $1 million property, but I can only find $800,000 replacement, that leftover part you can invest. So I bought the real property here local, but that leftover you can invest in a DST. You're still covering your entire 1031, so you don't have to pay any of those taxes, but you're invested in a couple of different properties.
Okay.
And then I guess this is kind of a third, not really a risk necessarily, but where it's perfect are people who are ready to retire. So if I'm tired of changing leaky toilets out and answering that 3 a.m. phone call with my rent house, and I just want to be done, a DST is a good option for people who are ready to retire, that they're still deferring those taxes, but with a DST, it is not actively managed by me. So it's passive ownership. You still own the real property. You still get to defer all those taxes, but I don't have to change the leaky sink. So that's not really a risk, but that was kind of my 3 main, like where a DST potentially fits in.
Gotcha.
Now in a QOZ, it's brand new. So I think that was, probably one of the risks for sure that we need to talk about. Political risk is a big one right now. I don't want to get into, politics stuff, but right now, the House is controlled by the Republicans, the Senate is controlled by the Democrat White House. So they kind of balance off each other, which is what the founding fathers meant to do, so that one side doesn't get too crazy and they all kind of checks and balance on each other. So probably, in the good thing, nothing's going to happen in Washington. So none of the laws are going to change. But I know we complain about nothing happens in Washington, but sometimes that's a good thing if they're not changing some of the laws that we like, right? So if, for example, the White House and the Senate and everything changed into one party or the other, then, if they're all the same, then they'll all like kind of have the same ideals, and things could change, good, bad, or ugly, depending on what you think about that. Again, on the risk, the timeline, the hold on a DST potentially could be a lot longer than you might want to. There's not an option for liquidity on that. So that's, again, especially with the DST, that's why they have to be accredited investors, because we'll have to show that they can afford to keep that investment inside that investment for a certain amount of time. And they have other liquidity. So I've got cash in the bank, or I've got other investments, 401k, that I can pay my bills and that kind of stuff. And you're not reliant on that. So that's, one of the things is just that long term. And then the QOZ, back to, it's new. So this is our first cycle of that. So we'll see how it goes, and if it all goes as planned. People are really excited about it in my industry, and we're really, again, back to that, if you think about it being sort of like a Roth, for people who are accredited investors, they can't invest in a Roth because their income is probably over the threshold, because there are limitations on individuals or married couples that can invest in a Roth. With the QOZ, you have to be a higher accredited investor to even do it. So it's kind of like a Roth for wealthy people, to get that same sort of tax advantage of all tax-free growth. So it just kind of, that's one of the main, I guess it's not a risk, that's a good thing, but that's one of the main reasons that people really like it. But again, it's a new one, so we're figuring it out.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So, I mean, it's hard to predict the future, and I know that that's not something that you can do necessarily, but what do we see as like the future of these two things, the 1031s and the QOZs going forward?
Well, so back to QOZ, I think they're currently the timeline of December 31st, 2026, and then 2047, way out there, where you have to take the money out. They're talking right now about extending that, or just doing kind of another round of that, because I forget, there's a legislative process that that the Congress can do, and it lasts 10 years, and so that's why the QOZ was a 10-year thing. I forget, my dad, I know when I get off this, it's called this. I know he just wants to scream it at me right now, but I got my headphones, it's like I can hear him. So, but we'll come back and add that in the comments later of what that is. But so that's why it's a 10-year deal. It was a special procedure that was done with the legislator. Now, on the 1031, it gets brought up quite a bit in that political legislative risk of whether or not it's going to stick around, or they might put limitations on it. So right now, there's no limit on 1031. So if I have a $5 million property and I want to defer all of those taxes, I can. If I have a $20 million property, again, works, so it scales up and down. So there's been talks about getting rid of it, or just limiting that. So, if I have 20 million, but the limit might be 5 million in the future. So that's probably one of the main potential of how it might evolve. But it's been around for almost 100 years, and people really like it. People on both sides of the aisle, back to the political, I'm trying not to get political on this kind of stuff, but, people who are developers and on the business side of things, and they want to, continually develop and build and grow and all that kind of stuff, they really like it. People on the other side of the aisle, really like it to protect landowners, so that people, if a developer comes in and wants to buy that farm that's been in the family for 100 years, that farmer is not that developer who understands all these complex tax laws, but if they sell that kind of stuff, could qualify to do this. And so it protects the little individual person, but it also protects big people with all kinds of money too. So people on both sides of the aisle like it. So hopefully it'll stick around. I know our broker dealer and all the investors that put the DSTs and stuff together, they're constantly watching it. And right now everything's rolling along like it's supposed to, and there's nothing imminent coming right now. So so hopefully that answered that question. Yeah,
things don't move super fast, do they?
Yeah. Which is sometimes frustrating, sometimes
very slow. Yeah. Well, cool. This is such a great conversation, Kyla. I'm really glad that we had it. I know there was a lot of there may have been like some confusion, amongst the audience on like different things, like what the QOZ is, what the 1031 is, et cetera, et cetera. I for those of you in the audience, I wish you well on your research in all of this if you're out there learning about it, because it is not simple, but it can be very beneficial. And I know that Kyla agrees with me on that. So
Yes.
Kyla's email address is going to be in the description if you need it or want to speak with her. And of course, you can always give me a call if you are looking to buy, sell, invest in real estate here in Oklahoma. I would be thrilled to help you. And yeah, we will see you guys next time. And I'd love to see all your comments on this conversation. Thank you so much.
I'm so excited. Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Kyla. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.